Russia still projects strength, but on the battlefield, it looks increasingly like desperation. Ukraine says Russia has suffered about 1.26 million casualties, killed and wounded, with no decisive breakthrough. Heavy losses and equipment shortages are forcing constant recruitment just to sustain the war. And the army, once called the world's second largest and strongest, is losing momentum. Joining me now is Preston Stewart, a military analyst and YouTuber, a West Point graduate and former U.S. Army Field Artillery officer. Preston, great to have you here on War and Politics, and nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So Preston, Russia continues to suffer massive losses in Ukraine, yet it keeps fighting. At what point do these losses become unsustainable for them? Do you see any real risk that Russia would be forced to stop or scale down the war due to manpower and equipment depletion?
We, some time ago, entered a point that I don't think many people expected. I was talking with some old Army friends this morning where they were talking about the number of Russian casualties, and we never really thought that we would experience this in our life. We thought life was too valuable, that nobody would send their men to slaughter like that. And that I think a lot of Western analysts, put myself in that same camp, assumed that we would have crossed a threshold a long time ago, that this was too much for the Russian people to absorb. And at some point they would say, what are we really doing here? Is this worth 10, 20, 50,000, 100,000 of our sons and our fathers? That point, I thought we would have gotten to a long time ago, admittedly. So it's hard to look at it now and say that you're close, that it's just another 100,000 or whatever the number might be. It's a little bit scary to think that any country or any leader of a country is so willing to throw this many people to their death. I hope that there's a tipping point where the people of Russia will say this is getting out of control. We're going to sacrifice an entire generation. But again, I thought that time would have come a while ago. So maybe, I know there's the new initiative of trying to inflict 50,000 irreplaceable casualties a month. That'd be a big jump. Maybe after 3, 4, 6 months of that, we do see a change in Russian behavior. But as of now, again, it's just a little bit unfathomable that we're in this situation in 2026.
Russia is advancing at historically slow rates. And according to data from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, in one of its most prominent recent campaigns, Russian troops advanced just under 50 kilometers from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk from February 2024 to January 2026. An average pace of them is about 70 meters per day. Are there drones, from your perspective, you've been on the front line, the main reason for that slow pace of Russians?
They are. Ukraine has done a great job of shifting the fight. For a long time, it was heavily focused on manpower, maneuver warfare for a period, and then artillery. And a lot of the early casualties in the movement was focused around heavy artillery bombardment. And Ukraine, by shifting to more of a drone focus, has pushed that, what used to be called a no man's land all the way back to World War I. The name has changed to the kill zone. And it's just gone from 5, 10 kilometers in some areas to 50 in more. And we see the videos coming out of this. One of the most shocking things of this conflict is you can see the videos of these Russian soldiers getting dropped off and trying to walk 10, 20 kilometers forward and just hope they can find some place to hide from the Ukrainian drones. Kill zone is the appropriate way to put it. The Ukraine has pushed that out further and further. Some Russians are getting through, but I actually really like that graphic you showed from CSIS. The areas that we're seeing that progress, albeit slow, Russian progress, Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, Kupiansk, they're comparing that with some of the largest battles of World War I and World War II. And I just don't think, 4 years ago now when Russia kicked this off, they would be comparing their progress in meters as a fraction of that on the Western Front in World War I. I think that really puts in perspective how slow they're moving at this point.
But at the same time, the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, just said that he is rejecting a peace terms without Russia gains in Ukraine. Do you think that's really the kind of confidence, or just it's the language of a country that losing, but that just cannot admit it?
A while ago, I would have thought that this is just strong language, negotiating tactics, right? To say we're gonna hold the line, that we're gonna ask for the most possible, but it's hard to hold that belief anymore, as we've not really seen any wavering on the Russian side. More and more, and the longer this goes on, I get the impression that Putin needs war to stay in power. No doubt this has been bad for Russia. It's been bad for the Russian people. It's been bad for the Russian economy, but it has in some ways kind of cemented Putin's authority in a lot of ways. And there's no clear successor. Nobody, when he steps down or is forced out, there's no clear person that's going to take over for him. And if the war stops tomorrow, I mean, there'd be plenty of Russian families that would be happy that their loved ones would come home, but there'd be also a lot of Russian families where their wages would fall, and defense factories that no longer would be needed, and supply chains that would go dry. And without an immediate lifting of sanctions and major intervention to prop up the Russian economy, they'd be in real trouble. I think Putin sees that and has kind of put himself into a position where he needs the war to appease those people on the home front. And that's concerning, because you're no longer talking about what is a rational decision to end the war. It's about staying in power, and that is probably not something that's going to be negotiated between the two parties.
Absolutely. You know, Preston, this week there was a drone swarm attacking Russian capital Moscow. And I think it's for the third time during the last 2 months. And, you know, I was thinking, to what extent Putin will still lie to his people that war is somewhere there, far away, and you are living your peaceful life in Moscow, which is already not. So it just, you know, the war is approaching. They're closing the sky. All this Vnukovo, Domodedovo airports, they are not working. So I just, I don't know for how long Russians will gonna accept this lie.
Little by little, it seems like there's more being forced on them. They're forced to acknowledge that it's happening. You know, for a period of time, it was the casualties. You can lie about the casualties and hide them, but at some point they become so numerous that you just can't make that up anymore. I think we crossed that line a while ago. The drone strikes are another one. I mean, I remember the first time a drone impacted, or around the first time one impacted in Moscow, and people thought it was crazy. In fact, there were lots of folks blaming Russian separatists, saying this is probably, or even the Russian government, saying this must be a false flag to try to get Russia to come down even harder on Ukraine. But to your point, it's pretty regular now. I mean, I would say daily, that drones are impacting inside of Russia, and a fair amount of them are hitting targets in Moscow. You know, by the end of the year, we're going to see even more of that. The war is going to be brought more and more to the steps of the Russian people.
And Ukraine is slowly but steadily reclaiming territory and shifting local dynamics on the battlefield. How is the Ukrainian army managing to regain initiative despite Russia's larger resources?
They're adapting very, very well. We talked about the adaptation from an artillery-focused fight that Russia wants to wage to drone warfare, and we're seeing Ukraine carry out more kind of targeted, heavily resourced, and heavily intelligence-driven operations. Kupiansk was a good example. Dobropilia, just north of Pokrovsk, was a good example, and right now in the Zaporizhia direction. So we're not seeing, you know, multiple armored brigades trying to break through the Russian lines like we saw back in 2023. That's not really in the cards, and Ukraine isn't trying that. Instead, they're taking advantage of where, in certain areas, Russia has exaggerated or outright lied about some of their advances, and they're vulnerable. So it's not a widespread offensive. It's not trying to necessarily even take back significant portions of territory, although that has been the result in some of these cases. It's mostly just kind of, in a sense, like a boxer would fight. You wait to see exactly how your adversary acts, and you take advantage of the opening. And the opening that Russia has left vulnerable for a while now has been the overextension of their forces. They have a few soldiers 5 or 10 kilometers past the gray zone, and they say they control it all, and they very clearly don't. And we've seen Ukraine monitor that situation, move a number of dedicated assault resources into position, and then very methodically move through and kill and capture, importantly, capture a lot of those Russians that are kind of isolated. So it's again, every year, every few months, we see a pretty significant change in the tactics, and this right now is what Ukraine is pursuing. It seems smart.
My guess that after this 100 drone attack on Moscow, their propaganda will persuade their people that it's not Ukraine on itself, but it's a NATO helping Ukraine to attack Moscow. It should be like that. They could not admit that that Ukraine is capable to fly from Ukrainian territory to Moscow. So, yeah, I think something is like that is coming. Preston, what is really happening domestically in Russia today from your perspective? Is the country moving toward a North Korea-style closed system?
I think it's closer today to that than it has been, but I think they do still have a ways to go before they get to a North Korea-style model. They do have more friends, they do have more allies, and they've been pretty effective at bypassing sanctions and getting things into their country, much more effective than I think a lot of people expected. North Korea is still pretty, perfectly isolated in so many ways, right? There's very little going or coming from North Korea. I would say economically, Russia is trending in that direction, and this is one of those things that we thought that people would rise up and say enough. Something maybe small, but not being able to compete at the Olympics. That's the kind of stuff that you think would wear on people over time. And it's very hard from the outside looking in to tell, is that having an effect or not? Or is it hardening some of the people in their desire to see this through? It's hard to imagine that the average Russian is willing to accept all of these changes and these setbacks for some territory in eastern Ukraine that is not going to impact the citizen in Moscow at all. It's hard to see them really doubling down, but I think I might at times underestimate kind of the nationalism at play within Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why Ukrainians are not Russians, because we would rise immediately after some problems, as we are doing for decades. And we also see Moscow increasingly restricting platforms like Telegram and online spaces. Why is the Kremlin closing the information environment now? Do you expect another wave of mobilization in Russia? Would it make military sense for the Kremlin at this stage to do so?
I don't think they need to mobilize yet. It's interesting that conversation comes up about every 6 months to a year of, is this going to be the time where they do it? I don't think they're quite there yet. And I do think that's a big step for Putin to take, because we're talking about how hard he is working to not make this affect your average middle class to upper middle class Russian. Of course, this is affecting a lot of the poorer communities outside of Moscow. I don't think there's as much concern for them inside of the Kremlin. I think they still have time to hold off on mobilization. I don't think that's necessary quite yet. The shutting off of the internet in so many ways has been interesting. There's no positive that comes from that, right? We will, the argument being made in Russia is that Telegram now is being used to help carry out terrorist attacks. They're just going to say whatever they're going to say to shut off access. We'll see some bypassing that to a degree via VPNs, and it sounds like Telegram is on and off depending on the day. It's either on the verge of getting banned, or no, they're going to walk it back and it's going to be okay. But the more they're shut off from the outside world, just the more that hurts Russia is at the end of the day. There are a number of Russians that follow the conflict day in and day out, and they want to see Russia win this war, and they're very critical of the way that it's being executed, and they call out the Russian government when they lie about something. And in a functioning country, a functioning military, you want that. You want to be held to account, because if you're trying to make information or make decisions in a war zone off of bad information, that's a recipe for disaster. And the more Russia clamps down on modes of communication, which Telegram will limit the communication from soldiers at the front and commanders at the front to their families and to reporters, the more they clamp down on that, it's just going to put them in a worse and worse position. There's some downsides to that, of course, as well. I mean, any military, you have the risk of leaking operationally security sensitive information, or giving information to the adversary. But Russia seems pretty focused on shutting that off entirely, and I think it's probably going to be a net negative for them, short and long term.
Right. History shows wars usually end through face-saving exits rather than total defeat. But in Russia's case, any concession risks rewarding aggression. So is there, in your view, any realistic off-ramp that could end this war without either saving Putin at Ukraine's expense or destabilizing Europe?
It's tough. I think that's one of the reasons we haven't seen the negotiations, unfortunately, really go anywhere. I know we see a lot of the headlines in the last 6 to 9 months that say we're close and there's breakthroughs, but and I don't want to diminish the value of talks, because to your point, that's usually the direction that conflicts end. But a lot of the progress has been made on things that I would argue are not critical to ending the war, and there's not been a lot of progress on the discussion around territorial control or security guarantees. So it's very hard to see what the thing could be that could actually get, in this case, Putin to agree to ending the war. Maybe something where if NATO really put their foot down, I think there's the possibility it would be a gamble. But if NATO were to, say, admit Ukraine and then put NATO forces into Western Ukraine and start backstopping it and saying we are only here in a defensive capacity, that might be enough. Putin is scared of NATO. He does not want a direct conflict with NATO, despite all of the random nuclear threats that come out every other week. If he were to have to make a decision that continuing the war would mean a direct conflict with NATO, no questions asked, I think that could be enough for him to go to the Russian people and say, look, we got a lot, we got something. Of course, that list would probably be modified in some way, shape, or form to explain a victory. Unfortunately, I don't think that's really in the cards right now. So we're kind of in this limbo period where it's not clear. Doesn't look like Russia has the ability to win this on the battlefield anytime soon. Unfortunately, I don't know that Ukraine has the ability to forcibly push Russia out of the occupied territory, and the negotiations don't seem to be going anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. We had on the anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion a few days ago, on the 24th of February, we had a huge event, yes, conference, and it usually gathered a lot of politicians and military advisors, generals around the world. And there was a friend of Ukraine and quite often guest to Ukraine, Boris Johnson. And he was saying, the beginning of conversation, he said, I don't believe in any peace negotiations. But, at the end of the day, everybody's asking, so what are the solution? Okay, we're not believing in that, so what are our next steps? Well, his suggestion was that Europe is doing only 10% of what they could do. But from the other hand, despite the fact that we don't like what the White House is saying right now, the Trump's administration, we still have the strongest Ukrainian ally, and it's the United States. So we just, I don't know. Everybody's talking about that. Everybody.
Yeah, I am in the camp that if more pressure had been applied to Russia earlier and more frequently in the form of sanctions, maybe in the form of more weapons or different weapons, I think the conversation would be very different right now. I don't know that it would have necessarily ended the war, but I think that's something missing in all of this. Is a good way to try to get Putin to negotiate is to come at him from a position of strength. And Ukraine's allies have the ability to help Ukraine get to that point. And we haven't, not just the United States, but a lot of our European allies as well. Just across the board, we haven't really gone all in a way that might actually get us to a peaceful agreement.
Absolutely. Yeah, as Boris Johnson said, we let you down, all of us. And I'm like, well, I don't feel better after this. Okay, yeah. And Preston, from an American perspective, tensions with Iran, I could not, avoid this topic. Tensions with Iran are rising again, and it feels like something is coming up in the nearest day. So how serious does the risk of escalation or conflict look right now? Is it really approaching, something like this weekend or next one?
We've been on the brink for a couple of weeks at this point. We have to imagine that there's some sort of military action coming. Technically, we could walk it back, but this is the largest buildup in 20 plus years. Um, it could be a flex for the negotiations. The negotiations, as of today, don't really seem to be going anywhere. We've drawn hard lines that are very contradictory to the Iranian hard lines. And with the military power in the region, they're not going to be there forever. So it's probably leading towards some sort of strike. The big question is what comes after. I mean, and that's what nobody has really been able to answer at this point, is limited strike, could be limited bleed over into regional instability. But the bigger the strike, the bigger the targets. If we go after some senior officials in the regime, you're talking about pretty significant fallout. Missile strikes throughout the region, drone strikes throughout the region, maybe the activation of some of the proxy networks. So we're at an interesting spot with that right now. It doesn't really seem like there's something forcing our hand at the moment, other than the fact that we have the talks ongoing and the military assets in the region. So maybe we all just walk it back, but this is a pretty significant deployment not to put it to use.
Okay, if the United States gonna attack Iran with missiles and those gonna fight back, I mean Iranians, I'm curious, how is the Iranian air defense system looks like on the ground?
Not great.
Not great.
So not great. So they famously rely on Russian air defense systems, a lot of S-300s, maybe some 400s. But back during the 12-day war, the Israeli Air Force pretty much just eliminated the entire thing. I mean, they were flying non-stealth aircraft over Tehran about 4 days into that conflict. So, we know that replacing air defense assets is a long-term thing. It's very costly. And if you're Iran and you're looking to pick those up, where are you going to get them right now? Because I don't think Russia is producing so many air defense assets that they can start selling those to their allies whenever they want. So the skies over Iran are rather permissible right now, especially to stealth aircraft. But it's still a risk. For a comparison here in the U.S., this is very different than Venezuela. There's a lot of openings to move aircraft into Iran, but they still have a lot of capabilities to shoot down U.S., Israeli, or anyone flying over their skies.
And what if Iran lose control of the Gulf region? What's next?
If Iran loses control?
Yeah.
So an interesting one here is we've got all of these regional allies that are closer with the United States than Iran that are kind of pushing back on a U.S. strike. And the argument being made there is they don't want the instability. They don't want the refugee crisis.
Yes.
They don't want a unstable nation. A line I heard recently is they want Iran to implode, not explode. They don't like the regime, but they very much don't want the fallout to bleed across the entire region. That's really tricky to do, to affect regime change or accomplish very specific objectives with a few days or even a few weeks of airstrikes. So I think that's why we're seeing a pushback right now. It could go in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, speaking about directions, how might the US-Iran crisis affect Ukraine and global security in the coming weeks or months?
Interesting one. So in a lot of ways, Iran and the United States have kind of shifted away from the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Russia's not getting a lot of their munitions at this point from Iran. At one point, they were getting a lot of their drones. We know Russia's kind of onshored a lot of the Shahed or Garan manufacturing, and Iran needs those now. So that direct link is limited compared to what it was. And unfortunately, the same for the United States. We have withdrawn some equipment from Europe. We're not sending munitions to Ukraine, and I think at all at this point. So in the short term, not a big impact. I would argue that a year or two ago it might distract us from helping facilitate it into the war, but I don't think we're playing much of a role there really at all. So in the short term, I don't think there'd be much of an impact. Longer term, this would pull the United States focus infinitely more than anything happening in Ukraine. We saw this. A comparison would be when October 7th happened in Israel. We saw a rapid shift in the media environment to where the news cycle was getting a little bit tired of Ukraine and the conflict there. And they spent so much attention, so much energy for about a year on hyper coverage inside of Israel and inside of Gaza. I think we'd see something similar the longer a war with Iran plays out. Understandably so, in some ways, right? If the United States is directly involved, we're probably going to be more focused on that. So in that case, I would expect anything Ukraine related to fall down the list quite a bit, just not be anywhere near as high of a priority, whether that is negotiating some sort of future arms packages, additional programs like Pearl to provide weaponry to Ukraine, security guarantees, or even the ceasefire and negotiation process. The minute the U.S. is in a hot war, that's going to take the vast majority of our government and political focus.
That's a very good point, Preston, actually, because when I was scrolling your YouTube channel, I would say that the Russia's war in Ukraine topic is not that active as Iran, for instance. You made an amazing video about if the Americans will attack, how it's going to look like, yeah, from your perspective. And I was like, and Mexico issues. So yeah, I think it's already happening, what you're saying. But Preston, you said actually, you named the Iran drone. And my question is, maybe the final one, how did you meet the idea that it was in Iran 5 generation drones? There was the details from the United States and Germany. So somehow they are reaching Russia, and it was not from the stockpiles. It was like 2024, 2025 production.
They're good at this. They've figured out a lot of ways. Now they've had a couple of years of practice, the Russians, at bypassing sanctions. We know, unfortunately, that these things are never 100% anywhere around the world. They're very, very hard to completely clamp down. It's frustrating to see that. I mean, it'd be frustrating to see our equipment going to commercial use in Russia at this point, because the whole focus of these sanctions is to make it harder and kind of squeeze Russia. So anything getting through is frustrating. The fact that some of it's showing up in military equipment, even more so. I would hope that the sanctions make it harder to get those. So maybe without the sanctions, they'd have 5, 10x the number available. But I mean, there's got to be ways to tighten that up, I would imagine. But even as tight as it gets, there's going to be smugglers and folks helping to bypass that system. I'm not sure if you saw that report about a month ago, talking about the U.S. Wi-Fi provider and how some of their distributors were kind of assisting Russian military in bypassing sanctions, saying, "Oh, this is how you do it. This is where you order it to, and this is what you say." And that exists, and it's going to exist. I just hope we can do everything we can to close all those loopholes.
Yeah, when I'm listening to you, I'm recalling that Russia, for me, is like a Greek mythical Hydra. You're cutting one hand, and 3 others will come out. You know, that speaking about sanctions. Yeah. Unfortunately, they're always finding a way. So, Preston, thank you so much for your time. It was such a pleasure to speak to our audience with you. And thank you for your insight. And I would love to see you again in our studio online.
Absolutely. It's my honor. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.